Welcome to a Cloud Developer channel. In today's video, we're going to talk about dependency injection in ASP.NET MVC Core application. The items we're going to discuss are explain the dependency lifetimes, create an application settings service, registering the application settings service as a singleton. We're going to go ahead and create a new database table to hold the values that are going to be used by the application settings service. And then we're going to use the application service from a view. So let's get started. We're going to go ahead and open up the context application that we've created in our prior videos. And what we're going to start off with is a discussion about the dependency lifetimes. Specifically, there are three types of built-in application or service lifetimes that are available in ASP.NET MVC Core. The first one is the transient lifetime. And this is used when each time when you request a particular object, it's going to create a new instance of that object and clean it up after it gets used. There's a scoped type of a lifetime, and it is used in scenarios such as ASP.NET MVC applications where if you want to be able to reuse the same instance of an object for the duration of the given request, for things like database connectivity, or if you're connecting to a resource that you don't really need to connect more than once for a given request, this is useful to use a scope type of a service. And also the last one is the singleton type of an object, and this is typically used by things that are very expensive, so you don't want to initialize the connection to it or constantly have to disconnect and reconnect all the time. Or if the values are not changing, this is where you want to use a singleton type of an object where the information doesn't need to be retrieved all the time, and it will save you in resources and processing time. So let's jump to the solution real quick and start creating the actual application setting service. Now, the first thing I'm going to go ahead and do here is inside of the context.contracts project, I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder, and I'm going to call that interfaces. And in this folder, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new interface, and this interface is going to be called iApplicationService. Actually the iApplication settings service. I'm going to go ahead and make that a public service. And this service is actually going to retrieve a value, a settings value from a database that's going to be the application version. And since this is an interface, this is how you define a particular contract between different layers of your application. So I'm going to go ahead and say that anything that implements this particular application settings service is going to need to be able to return the application version. And it doesn't need to have a setter. I just need to be able to get the value. So now that this is defined, I can go ahead and start working on the registration of this particular service in my application. Now, where we do that is inside of the startup.cs file. And inside of the startup.cs file, there's the configuration services or configure services method. And in here, what we have is services.add singleton. And I'm going to go ahead and use the first signature. And in here, in this particular method, what it expects is the type of an interface, as well as the concrete implementation type that will be registered and created by default. So in this case, I'm going to say type of iApplication settings service, and use IntelliSense, and it already knows about the context.interfaces namespace. I'm going to go ahead and use that, and then comma, and now I'm going to define the specific object type that's going to implement that interface. And it doesn't exist yet, but I know what I'm going to call it, so I'm going to go ahead and define it here. And all it is just the application settings service itself. So I'm going to go ahead and define that here and go ahead and close that. So what's going to happen is if I try to build this, this will obviously fail because there is no object that or project that contains this particular class. So what I can do right now is I can go ahead and create a new project that's going to actually contain this new class, and I'm going to call this project context.services application settings service. So inside of this project, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a new class, and I'm going to go ahead and call that application settings service class. So I'm going to go ahead and make this a public, and then I'm going to reference the iApplication settings service interface. And using the IntelliSense from Visual Studio, I can actually use this little helper tooltip, and it knows about the contacts.contracts project. So I'm going to go ahead and add a reference to it. And the other thing you'll notice is that it still has this squiggly lines underneath it saying that the service does not implement the methods that are inside of the actual interface that are defined by the interface. So I can go ahead and click this and say implement interface, and this is where it's going to actually allow me to now return or implement a specific property that I need to be able to return to the consumer. Now, what I want to be able to do is I need to be able to talk to a database and retrieve the information from a database to be able to say this is the setting that's coming from there. And in order for me to do that, I have to first actually implement the database portion of the code. So the way to do that is inside of our contacts.db project, what we want to do is we want to create a new model that's going to represent the actual settings or the properties that I'm going to be returning. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new class that's going to be called property. This property class is actually going to be comprised of a few different things. The first one is going to be the ID. There's going to be property name, a property value, a property category, as well as a created timestamp, so that in case we need to know when the properties actually got created, we have that in the database as well. So let me go ahead and create those properties here. So the first one would be property long of property ID. Then we're going to say a property string, property name, property string, property value, and property category. And then last is going to be a property for the creation of that particular property. So it's going to be a date time, and it's going to be created date. So these are all the properties that we're going to store inside of our database. And what we can do now is go ahead and actually go to SQL Server Management Studio, and we're going to create the table that's going to actually hold this particular information. So we already have the database created for our contacts application, and I'm going to go ahead and right click and select table, and I'm going to go ahead and define all the same properties that I've defined in my property model object. So I'm going to go ahead and say the first property is going to be property ID. The data type is going to be a big int. It's not going to allow nulls. Property name is going to be a varchar, and I'm going to allow it to be 200, and it's also not going to have nulls. Property value can have a null value because it is okay to not have any particular value or any particular setting. And then property category, and it's going to be a varchar, and I'm going to make that 200 as well. And I'm also not going to make it a nullable value, and I'll have a default set. And then last is the created date, and it's going to be date time, and it's also not going to allow the usage of nullable values in here, and I'm going to mitigate the issue of not having values supplied by the consumer by forcing a default value in here. So before we start setting all those default values, I'm going to mark this property ID as a primary key, and also I'm going to go ahead and specify that this is an identity column, so it's going to automatically increment actual values inside of the column for me, so I don't have to constantly manage it. And then for the property value, it's going to be a nullable field, so that's okay. The property category is going to have a default value, and I'm going to just make it general. So anytime somebody actually says that they didn't specify a particular category, by default is going to just mark it as a general category for the property. Now for the created date, what I'm going to do is for the default value, I'm going to use a function that's available in SQL called getUTCDate. And what this is going to allow us to do is if somebody doesn't provide a particular date, it's going to get the date from the server and it's going to be in universal time. So it's going to store it in the database for us. So, and I'm going to call this table properties and go ahead and save it. So let's go ahead and refresh the list of tables that are available, and we can see the properties table available here now. I'm going to go ahead and click on edit top 200 rows, and we can see the information here. So we don't have any records here yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a property with the name of version, and I'm going to give it a value 1.0. And since I already have all the other defaults defined, I don't have to actually specify any values. Now SQL Management Studio actually has this exclamation point, and what it wants you to do is just refresh the view. You can right click and click execute, and you can see that the values got populated here correctly. So let's go back to Visual Studio, and the next step that we're going to want to take is actually to register the actual application service so that we can start using it. So if I go back to the startup.cs, we can see that it's still not able to actually find that application setting service because it doesn't know about the namespace and the fact that the actual service itself hasn't been registered. So the reference to the main application hasn't been actually set up yet. So I'm going to go ahead and use IntelliSense and add a reference, and now it should actually know about the service, and this project is now happy. So the next item that I need to do is I need to actually set up a constructor so that dependency injection can provide me with the actual context object to be able to talk to the database. And what I want to be able to do is inside of the constructor, I want to be able to actually specify the context object and use Visual Studio IntelliSense to go ahead and add a reference to it. I'm gonna make this argument a DB, name it DB, and as we've done in the past, I'm just gonna make a private property with a getter and a setter that allows me to just easily set the value coming from a constructor into the class, and then I can consume it throughout my class as I need to. So I'll use IntelliSense again to go ahead and generate a property, and I'm going to remove the public accessor and remove the private accessor on the setter. And now what I have is the access to the actual database logic that I will need to have to be able to use this application. So what I want to be able to do, however, is when this particular service gets instantiated, I don't want to have to constantly go back to the database to be able to retrieve the version information. And the way that I can do that is by creating a local variable, a private variable in this class that represents the actual version information that will be loaded when this application setting service will be created for the first time. So I'll make it a string variable, and I'm going to call it application version. And it's not going to be initialized to anything by default. And what I'm going to do is inside of the constructor, I'm going to actually call a method that doesn't exist yet. We'll go ahead and create it, and it's going to be initialize application settings. And what this is going to allow us to do is actually call a method that will go ahead and talk to the database and load the settings from a database. And inside of the getter here, then I'll just be able to return the particular value that is stored inside of the application version. So what I'm going to do is I need to be able to call the database and be able to talk to the database to say get me a list of properties. But as you notice that there's no properties. Now why is that? The reason for this is because we didn't actually define the properties just like we did for people before as a property inside of the context. So we could do that now. And I'm going to simply change this person to property. And I'm going to change the name of this property to properties. So now that I have that defined, I should be able to reference the properties object collection. And what I want to be able to do is say anywhere, well, basically get me a version property specifically, and I'm going to store it inside of the private variable that's called application version. So I'm going to go ahead and call where, and I'm going to also import the system.link namespace so I can use the extension method for where, and where p.name equals version. And what I want to do is I want to return the first occurrence of that version property. So first or default is going to get me that. And then I'm going to use a feature of C# where basically by putting a question mark you say that a value can be returned only if an object has been returned from this first or default. And then I'm going to go ahead and actually get the value. Now I need to actually set it to the application version, so I'm going to go ahead and do that here. And what this should do in the end for me is if it actually finds a property that has a version information, it will get the first property record and it's going to get the property value and populate inside of this version field. And now what I want to be able to do is actually just return that version field by doing this. And what's going to happen is anytime somebody says application version from within the application settings service, is going to retrieve the application version information, and I can go ahead and start using it. So that has actually set up the logic of how do we actually connect to the database, how do we pull the information and store it inside of the application settings service itself when it's first initialized. And the final step in this whole process is we want to be able to actually go ahead and consume this information. So what I want to be able to do is I want to go ahead and go to the views, and inside of the shared view there's a layout, and in this layout what I want to be able to do is actually display the version information. And just like we did before where we actually reference the application settings that are being injected into the application and into the view, I also now want to inject the application settings service, and I'll go ahead and copy and paste this inject statement here, and we'll modify it real quick. So I no longer need the I options because the actual application settings has an interface which I can use now, which is required by dependency injection. And I'll go ahead and change the namespace to contacts.interfaces, and here I'll go ahead and actually say application settings service, and also I'm just gonna call it just that, application settings service. So this way I'll be able to use the application settings service version or application version to be able to render it on the screen. So I'll scroll down to the bottom of where the footer is defined, and what I want to be able to do is after the application title I'm going to actually render out the version information. So I'll do that by putting a space V, and then I'm going to do the application settings service dot, and you'll notice that I don't actually get IntelliSense completion, and the reason for that is because I have the V in front of the symbol, and when you do this Razor freaks out a little bit. So there's a little trick. You basically put the open parenthesis, and then this allows you to actually get to the actual instance properties, methods, members of that given service, and then you can go ahead and close the parenthesis, and this will allow you to actually render that information coming from that service. So now that I've defined this, let's see if this actually worked. So I'm going to go ahead and run this, and let's see the results of everything we just did. So as you can see, the actual footer now contains the version information from our database. Now, Just something real quick to show you. If I go back to the database and actually change the version information to 1.1 and go ahead and press enter, the information now has been updated in the database. However, if I go ahead and refresh it, you'll notice that the version number hasn't changed, and that is the result of us using the Singleton lifetime for that given service. And the reason for that is because the actual application itself is still running. Just because we're refreshing doesn't mean that a new instance of that application static service has actually been created. So if I go ahead and close it, however, and start it back up again, the act of me closing actually also killed that application instance, and a new instance is being launched now after I clicked the play button, and you can see the information got refreshed. So that is how you actually use a singleton lifetime for that given service, and how you use dependency injection to be able to help manage the different logic for how objects are actually instantiated, how they're being passed around between different services, and a brief example of how you go ahead and create the different interfaces and services that will help you build a more scalable, more robust application. So hopefully this video was useful for you. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave the comments below. Also, go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you're interested in videos like this, as I will be coming out with additional videos and tutorials of how to actually do different coding using ASP.NET MVC Core. I'm going to start creating videos soon about using Linux and be able to host .NET applications on that as well. As well as if you just want to ask some specific questions and you're interested in seeing something that I haven't covered yet, then go ahead and leave your comments and feedback below as well. And I can go ahead and put that on my backlog of things that we can work together towards being able to learn together.